Okay, so have you ever thought about this? Whether the way we talk every day, with all its little quirks and weird turns of phrase, whether it actually hides some kind of deeper, really precise logical structure underneath.
Yeah, I think that's something philosophers have been, well, wrestling with for a very long time, actually.
Totally. It's like, on the one hand, you've got these super strict logical systems, all neat and tidy. And then there's us just rambling on about, the price of milk and whatnot.
Right. And that tension, that's exactly what we're going to be digging into today on this deep dive. We're tackling Montague semantics.
Montague semantics. Now, I bet that rings a bell for some of you out there, especially those who like to really get into the nitty-gritty of meaning, of how language actually hooks onto reality. When we're building arguments, telling stories, even just chatting about, the latest news, how do we actually construct meaning from these tiny little building blocks of words? That's where Montague semantics comes in, right? It gives us this sort of framework for understanding how we go from words to entire worlds of thought.
Exactly. And we're not going to get lost in the weeds here. We're going to keep things clear, concise, because we respect your time. But trust me, we're going to get to the good stuff, the really juicy philosophical bit.
Absolutely. And to do that, we've got our trusty guide, right? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, you guessed it, Montague semantics.
A solid, in-depth resource.
Yeah.
And our mission, our goal here is to really distill it down to the core ideas, to unpack the revolutionary concepts that Montague brought to the table.
Because let's be honest, this guy was a bit of a game changer, right? I mean, where did this whole Montague semantics thing even come from? Who was this guy?
Right. So the mastermind behind all this was Richard Montague, a logician, but really his background was heavily in mathematics. And that's actually super important for understanding his whole approach. He had this, well, you could call it a radical view, I guess. He basically said that natural language, the stuff we use every day to, order coffee, argue with our friends, write poetry, all that jazz, it's not actually fundamentally different from the formal languages that logicians use.
Hold on, seriously, because when I think logic, I think, those symbolic equations, all those weird symbols, but our language, it's messy, it's full of, I don't know, slang, double meanings, sarcasm.
And you're right, it seems like a huge leap, doesn't it? And you know what? Even Montague himself, a few years before he developed this whole theory, he was actually pretty skeptical about this very idea. He thought that applying logic to everyday English would be, quote, extremely laborious or impossible.
So what changed his mind? I mean, what flipped the switch for him?
Well, it seems like there were two major influences. First, there was Quine's work, Word and Object, which presented this really systematic way of thinking about how grammar connects to logical form. And then there was Chomsky, with his aspects of the theory of syntax. Chomsky gave this really formal account of how language is structured, even though at that point he wasn't really focused on meaning. Montague saw this incredible opportunity. He wanted to bring these two perspectives together, to build a bridge between how language is structured and what it actually means. And he wanted to do this not based on some vague intuition, but with mathematical precision. He was adamant that this wasn't just some hunch, but, and I quote, an assertion to which we have assigned exact significance.
Okay, so he wants to bring the rigor of hardcore math and logic to bear on how we make meaning? But how? What are the foundational building blocks of Montague semantics, the stuff that, a philosopher really needs to grasp?
Great question. There are two absolutely crucial features. The first is model theoretic semantics. Now, for philosophers out there, this might sound familiar. It's basically about interpreting language by creating these abstract models, kind of like simplified little world, using the tools of set theory and formal logic, and then you can see whether a sentence is true or false within that model. And the cool thing is, these models don't have to be perfect reflections of reality like the one we actually live in. They're more like reality as conceived by language. Like you think about how we talk about water, right? In our language, any little part of water, even down to a molecule, is still water. But from a physics perspective, that's not really entirely accurate.
So it's not about mirroring the world perfectly, but capturing how our language itself carves up reality, even if it's a bit, simplified or based on conventions.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second big idea, the principle of compositionality. Now, this one is super important for philosophers of language. It basically says that the meaning of a whole sentence, a whole phrase, it all depends on the meanings of the individual words and how they're combined grammatically.
So you don't just add up the dictionary definitions of each word. You got to look at the grammar, the structure.
You got it. Like imagine you've got the verbs walk and sing. Let's say walk refers to all the people who walk and sing to all the people who sing, right? Now, if you combine them with and, walk, and sing, that means you're talking about the folks who do both, the intersection of those two groups. And then if you add John to the mix, John walks and sings, you're saying John is one of those people who both walks and sings.
Mm.
This principle has a really powerful consequence. Every single part of a sentence that's grammatically important has to have a meaning too. And every rule we have for combining words in grammar has to have a matching rule for combining meanings in semantics. Even the history of how a sentence was built, like how the words were put together step by step, can affect its meaning.
Okay, that's pretty neat. So you break down the grammar, you break down the meaning, and the grammar tells you how to put those meanings together. But let's get a bit more philosophical here. How did Montague deal with those really tricky concepts like belief or necessity? You know, the stuff that philosophers love to argue about.
That's where intentionality comes in. This is where Montague's work gets really relevant for philosophical heavy hitters. He took Frege's famous distinction between sense and denotation and ran with it. You can think of denotation as what a word refers to in the real world, but the sense is, well, it's like the way the reference works, the mode of presentation. For Montague, these Fregean senses became intentions, which are basically functions that map from possible worlds and times to extensions, which are the denotations.
Possible worlds, now we're talking. That's prime philosophical territory. How did he weave that in?
Right, well, think about this classic Frege puzzle. The ancient Greeks didn't know that the morning star is the evening star. Now, we know they're both Venus, right? So the denotation, what they refer to in the actual world, is the same. But obviously the Greeks weren't clueless about Venus being, well, Venus. The issue is that the way we refer to Venus as the morning star is different from how we refer to it as the evening star. And that's where intentions come in. They capture these different ways of referring, which might change across different possible worlds. Maybe in some other possible world, there's a different celestial body that's the brightest thing in the morning or evening sky.
So intentions help us separate expressions that, in our world, point to the same thing, but which have different cognitive baggage, different information attached to them. And that's crucial for talking about knowledge and belief.
Exactly. But Frege himself ran into problems when you've got these nested statements like, Gottlob suspected that the Greeks didn't know that the morning star is the evening star. It seemed like you'd need this endless chain of increasingly indirect senses. Montague had a more elegant solution, though. He used something called neighborhood semantics. Basically, these embedded clauses get interpreted relative to specific possible worlds or times, which are determined by the main verb, so you don't need this infinite regress of senses. And Montague saw this as aligning with what he called Frege's functionality principle. It essentially says that the denotation of a whole expression depends on the denotations of its parts in simple direct contexts, but on the intentions of its parts in those more complex indirect contexts.
Clever. So he builds on Frege's ideas but streamlines them, formalizes them in this really neat way. But wasn't there a point where he considered ditching this whole sense denotation thing, like going for a more straightforward Russellian approach?
Oh, you're remembering. In one of his earlier papers, English as a Formal Language, he did flirt with this idea of a one-level architecture, which focused mostly on those good old Russellian denotations. He even expressed some doubts about why Frege even bothered with senses in the first place. But later, in his major work, Universal Grammar, he backtracked. He admitted that actually the sense-denotation distinction, or as he put it, intension extension, is absolutely essential for a complete theory of natural language.
Okay, so intentionality is a key ingredient. Now, what about those philosophical head scratchers where you have logically equivalent statements? You know, they have the same truth conditions, but they don't feel like they mean the same thing. Like, take a super complex tautology. It just feels different from saying A equals A, even though logically they're the same.
Yeah, that's a tough one. In the standard intentional setup, all tautologies end up with the same intention, a function that spits out true for every single possible world. Montague knew this was a problem. He even suggested a way to deal with it, using these unactualizable points of reference to differentiate between them, but it never got fully fleshed out. And that's an area where people working in semantics have tried different things, like bringing in impossible worlds or tweaking the idea of logical entailment itself.
Impossible worlds, now we're really getting philosophical. You mentioned earlier that for Montague, compositionality wasn't just some handy tool. It was like a bedrock principle.
Yeah.
He even had a pretty memorable slogan for it, right?
Oh, yeah, he did. He said, and I quote, "Syntax is an algebra, semantics is an algebra, and meaning is a homomorphism between them." What he meant was there's this parallel structure between the rules of grammar, how we put words together, and the rules for combining their meanings. And assigning meaning is like this special map, a homomorphism, that preserves that structure as it goes from one algebra to the other.
Homomorphism, a map that keeps the structure intact. Very logician. But isn't there, like, tons of stuff in language that breaks this whole compositionality thing? I'm thinking idioms like kick the bucket. Obviously doesn't mean literally kicking a bucket.
Idioms, yeah, they're the classic example, the go-to challenge for strict compositionality. But linguists and philosophers working with Montague's framework have come up with ways to analyze them compositionally, too. One way is to treat the whole idiom as a single unit with its own special meaning. Another is to give the individual words slightly weird bleached meanings, so that when they combine, following the grammar, you get the figurative meaning. And it's not just idioms. There's been other supposed counterexamples, but a lot of them have been explained away with more sophisticated compositional analyses. So maybe compositionality is more resilient than it seems at first glance.
It seems like a really strong commitment for folks working in this framework. Is it just a matter of taste, a preferred method, or are there deeper philosophical reasons for sticking to compositionality?
It's a good question, and there are different schools of thought on that. Some say, nope, compositionality is non-negotiable. Every decent semantic theory has to be compositional, end of story. Others say, well, it's a good goal, a good way to go about things, but maybe there are other paths to understanding meaning. And then there are those who think it's an ideal that natural language only roughly approximates. And some even argue that whether language is truly compositional or not is an empirical question, something we got to figure out by looking at the data. It's an ongoing debate, for sure, but for Montague himself, it was definitely a core principle.
Okay, so we've got these two parallel worlds, syntax and semantics, both with their own sets of rules. How did Montague see the connection between specific syntactic categories like noun phrases or verbs and those semantic types like individuals or properties?
For Montague, syntax was basically a tool for semantics. He even said, famously, I fail to see any interest in syntax except as a preliminary to semantics. So while he did come up with explicit syntactic rules, his main focus was always on making sure those rules generated structures that could be interpreted semantically in a clean, systematic way. In his early work, the link between syntactic categories like noun phrase, verb phrase, sentence, and semantic types like individuals, sets of individuals, truth values, it was pretty straightforward, but also a bit Lisp-like. But later on, he moved towards a more principled relationship, similar to what you see in categorical grammar, where the syntactic category of a word tells you its semantic type and how it can combine with other words.
Categorical grammar, where the categories themselves tell you how things fit together and what they'll create.
Right. Though Montague's own system wasn't strictly categorical, like in the modern sense, some of his rules went beyond just putting words together, and they didn't always strictly follow category. This led to some interesting developments in Montague-inspired grammar. Some researchers tried to make it even more like categorical grammar, while others wanted to bring in ideas from more mainstream syntactic theories, like Chomsky's, and then apply Montague's semantic interpretations to those structures. There's a really influential textbook by Heim and Kratzer that does this kind of hybrid thing.
So the field has really branched out in different directions since Montague's original work. He also had some specific ideas about how those basic logical words fit into this picture, right? Words like and or not.
Yeah, he did. Montague treated those logical words like determiners, the a error, and connectives and or not, seen categorically. It's a mouthful, but it basically means he didn't give them their own separate meanings in the lexicon. Instead, they were built into specific syntactic rules. Why he did this is still debated, but some think he might have been trying to define grammatical meaning itself in terms of logical operations. But this approach led to some awkwardness, like having different rules for and depending on whether it was connecting verb phrases or whole sentences. Later on, semanticists proposed more general solutions, like using type-shifting rules or more general semantic principles, so that a word like and could have one core meaning that could be flexibly adapted to different syntactic contexts. This gave a more unified and elegant analysis of these fundamental logical bits of language.
So a move towards a more flexible and streamlined semantic system, even for those core logical elements. Now let's shift gears a little bit. What about context? I mean, surely Montague, being a philosopher of language, must have thought about how the context of an utterance affects its meaning.
Oh, absolutely. He did a lot of work on pragmatics. He knew that what a sentence means can depend on who's saying it, where, when, all that stuff. He proposed handling this by adding more parameters to his models, not just possible world and time. Things like who the speaker is, the location, all the relevant bits of the situation. There was some debate about how exactly to do this, but the general idea of incorporating a structured notion of context into formal semantics has become pretty standard practice.
It's like adding extra coordinates to our map of meaning, right? To pinpoint where the utterance is happening, who's saying it, all that.
You got it. And he even started to distinguish between parameters that actually help determine the content of what's being said, like time and world, and those that are part of the context itself and help fix that content, like who the speaker is. This foreshadowed later work by philosophers like David Kaplan on things like indexicals and demonstratives. At first, Montague put the study of context in pragmatics, but after his death, his framework was extended to deal with other aspects of pragmatics, like presuppositions and implicatures. But these later accounts often needed more complex models of the conversation and what the participants believe and intend.
So Montague laid this groundwork, and then others built on it, taking it in new directions. Now, one final area I'm curious about from a philosopher's perspective is ontology. Like, what kinds of things did Montague's system say actually exist? What was his view on that?
Good question. Montague's semantics was based on a typological hierarchy with three basic types of entities: truth values, possible individuals, and possible worlds. What counts as an individual and what the space of possible worlds looks like can change depending on the model you're using. But truth values were always fundamental, the same in every possible world. Later work in semantics, building on Montague's ideas, often expanded this basic ontology to include things like events or eventualities, so you could better account for what verbs and verb phrases mean. And some even added structured entities to deal with mass nouns and plurals.
So going beyond just individual things and their properties to include things happening, events unfolding, and also how we refer to groups or substances.
Exactly. And interestingly, Montague differed from some earlier logicians by treating possible worlds as basic, unstructured things, not models of some other formal language. He thought this opened up new possibilities for philosophical analysis. His big idea was to use intentional logic, rooted in his semantic theory, as a foundation for philosophical inquiry itself. He wanted to reduce those dubious entities like pains, tasks, obligations, even events, to predicate intensions, which are basically properties. So you could understand what it means to talk about a pain, for example, by looking at the property of being a pain across different possible worlds.
That's a pretty ambitious philosophical project. Did everyone buy into this whole ontological framework?
Not everyone, no. Some philosophers were worried about the commitment to these higher-order entities that popped up in Montague's system. They thought it implied that these things actually exist in some way. But the counter-argument is that using lambda abstraction and these higher-order types isn't about saying that language is ultimately about these abstract functions. It's more that they're powerful tools for describing how the meanings of smaller parts of language combine to make the meanings of bigger, more complex expressions. It's about the mechanics of meaning, not necessarily about what the world is ultimately made of. In fact, it's been shown that Montague's own fragment of English, even with all its fancy tools, is actually weaker in expressive power than full higher-order logic.
That's pretty wild.
Yes.
So Montague wasn't just analyzing language. He was suggesting that a really precise, logically grounded semantics could be a foundation for philosophical inquiry itself.
Right. He thought there was a profound connection between getting the semantics of natural language right and being able to tackle those big philosophical questions in a more rigorous and insightful way.
Well, this has been a pretty amazing deep dive into a really complex and influential theory. So for you, our dear listener, especially the philosophers out there, what are the key takeaways from Montague semantics?
All right, so for you philosophers, here's the gist. First, the groundbreaking and still debated idea that our everyday language, even with all its quirks and messiness, has a logical structure under the hood, and we can use the tools of formal logic and math to analyze it. Second, the principle of compositionality, a powerful idea that says the meaning of a whole expression comes from the meanings of its parts and how they're put together grammatically. Third, intentionality, formalized with those functions from possible worlds to extensions, giving us a nuanced way to deal with those tricky philosophical problems about meaning, belief, necessity, all that good stuff. And finally, Montague's legacy, which continues to shape research in linguistics, philosophy of language, even AI and cognitive science.
So, if our everyday language is really this kind of like disguised formal system, what does that tell us about how we think? And could understanding this hidden logic make us better communicators, better thinkers? Montague, with his love for precision and mathematical tools, thought he was unlocking some fundamental secrets of language. After this deep dive, what new insights about language have you gained? And what new philosophical questions has this approach sparked for you?
We really encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating topic. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Montague semantics is a great starting point. And there's a huge list of further reading there, too, if you want to go deeper. We've only just scratched the surface here. This is a body of work that can really change how you think about language and meaning.